Welcome to the Global Peace Film Festival Lives Online Conversation 2023 Festival Edition. Please join me, Kelly Devine, the Artistic Director, and Nina Stripe, the Founder and Festival Director, in conversation with filmmaker Rick Minnich as we discuss his film, The Strait Guys, which you can see at our upcoming September event. Please go to peacefilmfest.org to check out all the details. But now let's welcome Rick to the conversation. Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, Kelly.
Hi, Rick. It's great to see you.
Hi, Nina. Yeah, nice to see you too.
From Berlin. And let's start out. Tell us a little bit about the film.
Okay. The Strait Guys is the story of a retired Czech-born mining engineer named George Kumal, who had the grand vision of building the world's longest train tunnel that would connect, I got my little globe here, that would connect the United States and Russia across beneath the Bering Strait. So here's Alaska, and this is Russia, and it's only 50 miles separating our two countries. So the old Sarah Palin joke about that she could see Russia from her home in Alaska there's some truth to it. And in the film, we follow George and his American and Russian partners as they travel along a proposed route across Alaska and across Siberia. And we have all kinds of adventures along the way, meeting with various politicians, railroad people, indigenous tribes, and they're always trying to convince the stakeholders to build this railroad, which they say would be the Panama Canal of the 21st century.
Oh, fascinating, Rick. So how was it that you came to know about George, and what was it that captivated you to start documenting his journey?
Well, it kind of goes back to my own childhood. I grew up with a globe, like, a physical globe in our home. And I was always like to turn it around and look at it, and was always dreaming about all these places in the world. And I went to high school in the mid 1980s. It was still the Cold War. But Gorbachev had come into power, and there was a the US and Soviet Union were kind of getting a little closer together. There's sort of a thawing there. And at some point I noticed that our so-called enemies, the Russians or the Soviets, were actually our neighbors at the Bering Strait. And I grew up in California mostly, so on the West Coast, and it's not that far away. And I started thinking about it because I always thought about Russia I always thought in the other direction, looking east, past New York and then over to Europe, and then it's far away. But if you look at it from the top, like from the northern perspective, or from the perspective of Alaska, Russia's right next door. And this kind of stuck in my mind. And then around 2008, I finished a film called Forgetting Dad, and I was trying to figure out what to do next. And then I started thinking about the Bering Strait and did a little online research. And I kept reading about George Kumal, a retired Czech-born mining engineer who lives in Tucson, Arizona. So I just looked him up in the Tucson phone book online and called him, and he was thrilled that someone was interested. And we talked for about an hour. And he said, "Oh, I'm going to be in Washington, D.C. in a few months for a US-Russian conference. Why don't you come over and we can meet?" So I did. I didn't even have a real camera then. This is 2010. I just had this little pocket camera. I didn't know what I was getting into, but I met George and discovered that he has a sidekick from Alaska named Joe. And they were two funny old men, kind of like the Odd Couple or something. And suddenly we were invited to a reception at the Russian embassy, and we were meeting the Russian ambassador, and we were meeting Congressman Denis Kucinich, who was very excited by this project. And all these things started happening. And I just had this little camera. Some of that footage is in the film. I didn't know what I was getting into. And then one thing led to the next. And a couple months later, they said, "Come to the English Channel. We're going to go come to France and England, and we're going to go meet with the people from the English Channel to find out how they built it." And they just said, "Well, or be at this train station in Paris at this time, and we're going to ride the Eurostar, the train through the tunnel." And I showed up at the train station, and there was this Korean man with a sign with my name on it, Mr. Minnich. And he escorted me onto the train, and then I arrived, went through the tunnel and came out in England, in Folkestone, England, and was taken to the hotel. And then there were all these Korean people there. And it turns out that there's a Korean organization that was very interested in this project, and they were sponsoring this trip. And I became sort of the unofficial videographer, and they wanted me to film everything. And then suddenly we were having dinner with the Korean ambassador in London, and then a few nights later in Paris, and I was meeting more ambassadors and filming everything. And I didn't know what was going on. I just couldn't figure out what's this all about. And I got more and more intrigued because I thought, why would Koreans be interested in this? And then they explained to me that Korea might be a little hard to see on this globe, but South Korea is essentially an island. It has no land connection to the rest of Asia because of North Korea. The border's closed. So they see this as a Korean unification project, because if the train could go through South Korea, from South Korea through North Korea into Russia and China, and then over to the United States and over to North America. So for them, it would be finally having a land route. And South Korea is a huge export nation. So they would love to be able to export their goods by land and not only by ship and air. So suddenly I just got more and more intrigued, because there are so many different players involved, and there's this peace aspect. They were always emphasizing, the peace and peace through this large cooperative infrastructure projects. So I really kind of latched onto that, and one thing led to another, and it took 6 years to get all the funding in place. And then in 2018, we took the big trip across Siberia and across Alaska, and that's the bulk of the film.
Well, normally I ask filmmakers if there was anything in the process that surprised them about it, but it seemed like this was just a series of surprises in terms of.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the surprising things is that so few people have heard about this idea. It was actually originally proposed by Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. So this idea has been around since the 1860s. And when I was doing my research, I actually came across documents. I came across stock certificates from a corporation from 1906 that was raising all this money for it. And it almost got built in 1906. And then there was an intrigue in the Tsar's court in Russia, and someone convinced the Tsar that they should not build a tunnel, because then the Americans might invade across the Bering Strait, might invade Siberia. And then it brought up, history kept repeating itself. And apparently Lenin and Roosevelt and Stalin were all in favor of this. And wars kept getting in the way. And then we filmed in 2018, and then we finally finished the film and we released it. We're ready to release it in early 2022. And then Russia invaded Ukraine, and then another war. My producers and distributor were panicked. It's like, we can't release this film. We can't, anything with Russia is poison now. And I kept saying, but that's exactly why we need to release the film now. People need to see that there is an alternative way for the United States and Russia to cooperate and kind of to relate to one another. And one way to do that is to build this massive infrastructure project, which would physically link our two countries. And the model, the example that Scott Spencer in the film, one of the Strait Guys, always refers to is the space station, the International Space Station. And that was a cooperation that began in the early 1990s. In the early days after the Cold War ended, there was a lot of US-Russian cooperation back then. And that's a project which is still up there. The US and Russia are still cooperating peacefully in outer space. So the Strait Guys really want to show that it's possible to do that down here on Earth as well.
Well, and in fact, isn't the translation of the Mir space station isn't that word the word for peace in Russia?
Yes, it is.
So it just goes to show. So it's fascinating, because a lot of times when we are talking to people about kind of linking the subject matter of their film as a model, oftentimes it's a conceptual model, but this is about how infrastructure can model peace. So
yes.
And that's what intrigued me as a programmer for this film festival. What we're always looking for are ways to get people to think about what peace looks like, and then it doesn't always look like this utopian idea that instead it may in fact look like concrete and creosote logs creating a railroad track. So
Sure.
if you wouldn't mind, since this is really the central mission of our festival, to talk about, what peace, that idea of peace that was, so evident in what motivated you to tell the story.
Well, if we look back at the English Channel again, England and France have also had a pretty volatile history over the centuries. And that tunnel, which has been around since, it opened in the late 90s, I believe. So it's been around for a couple of decades now. And even though Great Britain, the UK left the European Union last year, the trains are still running. There's still cooperation going on, and it has helped, I think, create a certain stability between England and France because they have a mutual economic interest. And this was also a lot of the talk about here living in Germany, that Germany signed a lot of gas deals with Russia over the last decade or two, which have turned out to be a big problem since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But at the time, that's the same thought that like we can cooperate economically, this can stabilize our relationships. And it worked for a while until it suddenly didn't work anymore. But I personally believe that having economic ties, close economic ties, also lead to closer cultural ties. And when you have closer cultural ties and more exchange between people from different countries, that automatically leads to a more conducive environment for creating peace. And I experienced it. One of the most beautiful moments for me in making the Strait Guys was when we were filming in Siberia in near Yakutsk, and a new railroad station was about to open, and our guys, Strait Guys, met the Yakutia Railways people at the train station, and they got to ride on the locomotive there. And you get these train geeks kind of from two different countries together, and then they're like, the politics fades away, and they were just in their train world. And Scott was fascinated because the Russian tracks are wider than in the rest of the world. Basically, it's the first time he'd ridden on one of these trains with the wider tracks, and the Russians were super excited that an American delegation was coming, that they actually got out a locomotive, a diesel locomotive that they don't use so often, that was made by General Electric. And then I turned and they wanted to show it off. And it was a General Electric locomotive, but all with Russian lettering everywhere. It turns out later I found out that it's made in Kazakhstan under license from General Electric, but it's still, an American company. So there are all these twists where our guys were really warmly received in Russia, and it's a very peaceful environment. They got to speak at the Duma and the Russian Parliament. It's hard to imagine that was only 5 years ago, that so much has changed since then. But that's I'm optimistic that this war will end sooner rather than later, and that we can get back on track.
So to speak.
So to speak, yeah.
Such a fascinating story, and I hope everybody who's watching this will find a way to see the film, because it's something, it's just a unique story. So tell us how people watching this can support your work, and also what's coming up for you.
Well, we have a website, thestraightguys.com, so you can sign up for our mailing list, and we'll keep you informed about what's going on with the film. You can host a screening if you have some kind of an organization you're a part of. You can host a screening of the film through the website. You can find information about how to do that. Any group, any size. If you get together enough people and drum up a little bit of money, I'm happy to pipe in online and talk to you a little bit. We're looking for screenings in universities. We're in the process of selling the film to various libraries. We've had some television screenings. It was on national television in Germany earlier this year. It was on Canadian television last year. It will be on television in Finland, and we've got some other countries in the works. So the film's, it's finding its way. We're hoping that it will become a little easier once things get more peaceful in Ukraine, hopefully.
Well, we are all certainly, that is a great note to end on, that we're all hopeful that things, that peace comes to Ukraine and the integrity that they are fighting for. So thank you so much, Rick. This has been a fascinating discussion. I could talk to you all day about Seward's Folly up in Alaska. That's fantastic. And thank you to everyone who watched this particular conversation. If you want to find out more about The Strait Guys, the film, please go to thestraightguys.com, the website, sign up for the newsletter so that you can get those updates. Be sure to tell anyone that you know in higher education or libraries to check out this film and to buy it, because that would really support Rick's work. And please come out to see the film as a part of our in-person screenings, which start September 19th and run through September 23rd, and our virtual festival, which begins September 25th and runs through October the 1st. All the information about all of our screenings, including The Strait Guys, can be found at peacefilmfest.org. Thank you, and we'll see you at the next Glow.